immune function isn't as robust when you're older, but there's a lot more that we need to work on to figure out why. Respiratory viruses kind of are like a lawnmower. They mow down all of the cilia on your respiratory epithelial cells. And about every decade or so, the virus has what's called as an antigenic shift. It does a whole reassortment of its genetic material. And as a result, you get a whole new strain, which, we haven't seen before. And if you want to have a fun time, have a conversation or start reading the journals by the aerosol scientists. I never read anything they published, should have, but wasn't part of what I was interested in at the time in my career. But it turns out in the Journal of Indoor Air and Aerosol Science and so forth, they study what floats in the air. And one of the most recent studies shows that avian influenza that we're all very worried about can travel between chicken flocks many kilometers away, where one flock of chickens and a chicken farm are kilometers away from another chicken farm, and with the prevailing winds, just blows over to the other farm. So there are many examples of infectious diseases in the veterinary world and in the agricultural world that affect plants, like fungi that destroy crops, that float in the air. Indeed, if you travel 10,000 feet in the air and with an airplane and sample the air, you will find bacteria. So I think we had, as a human race, and certainly as a medical profession, severely underestimated what's in the air that we breathe. And there's a wonderful book that I would love to recommend called Airborne, The Hidden History of the Life We Breathe by Carl Zimmer. Carl Zimmer is a reporter and investigative journalist and wrote a brilliant dissertation, a beautiful book on airborne transmission. And I highly recommend it if you're interested in this kind of subject.
I will add it to my list. And correct me if I'm wrong, even if some diseases spread predominantly by just droplets like on a desk or a doorknob, if you create conditions that are conducive to aerosolizing, like just coughing or singing, speaking loudly, people can still get infected by those means.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the other COVID example was the Skagit Chorale, as they call it. It's a choir. And they in Skagit County in near Seattle, I believe. And very early on in the COVID pandemic, before anybody really before we really understood it as well as we do now, they had a rehearsal and somebody had COVID, and they had members of their choir pass away from COVID, and they all felt awful about it. And they realized, and it was studied in great detail, what happened by the public health and the CDC, and demonstrated who it was that had COVID, who spread it to who and how, and the dynamics of it were carefully worked out. And there's just so many examples of this.
Why are some people asymptomatic with diseases or have subclinical infections? Why is that?
Well, I mean, it's good for them, but bad for everybody else because they spread it. Asymptomatic transmission may be as much as 40%. And some of it's, you're just not symptomatic at the moment. You're sort of pre-symptomatic. And my personal example is when my now 2-year-old granddaughter was about under a year, got COVID. We didn't know it. And came to visit with us, and we were pretty careful. If kids had symptoms, they weren't coming to visit. Came to visit, and of course, they're adorable, so you're hugging and kissing and very up close and personal. And then a couple of days later, I didn't feel so good, and neither did my wife, their grandmother. And sure enough, we had COVID. But and then she got a fever and was ill afterwards. So we all had COVID. That's how it happens. That just struck me as really rotten that an asymptomatic, beautiful little grandchild, but that's just what this disease is all about. So I'm not wearing an N95 around my grandchildren. We check them for symptoms, and there's a certain risk that you just can't avoid, really, unless you want to live by yourself for the rest of your days. But this disease, asymptomatic transmission, we've discovered is 40%. Some of it is people who are going to be symptomatic. They're pre-symptomatic. Some are posse-symptomatic, which just means they never get many symptoms. We don't know why. Is it because of their some immunity that they have? Or they didn't get infected with a large dose of the virus, so they get a very mild case. Those details I don't think can be worked out.
What's the difference between them and, let's say, 65 years and older? Why are they the higher risk ones for the disease or many other diseases?
Well, yeah, we know that infectious diseases, on average, a characteristic of the rate of mortality is age. So being older is something you can't do anything about. But it is you have to be smart in your old age to avoid certain things. So if you get pneumonia as a child, you can get very sick or even die, but that probability is, unless you're very premature or small, much lower than that of someone who is in the over 65. And with each decade, into your 70s and your 80s and your 90s, the risks go up very significantly. I don't think we know quite the details. Immune function isn't as robust when you're older, but there's a lot more that we need to work on to figure out why. So, there was that debate early on. Oh, the kids don't get COVID. Well, that was wrong. Kids don't get severely affected by COVID. Well, that was wrong too. The mortality, thankfully, is much lower in younger people. Imagine if it was the other way around. COVID would have been tragedy even worse. It was affecting young kids. But measles does affect young kids and RSV. And so, kids have their challenges as well. So we know that age is an important risk factor. I think the immunology of this and the mechanisms of it are still need to be worked out.
I just want to linger on the point of RSV in children because that's a common cold. We've all probably had it, especially, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe, if you're 2 years old, you probably had an RSV infection. But out of every 100 kids that has an RSV infection, one or two of them will be hospitalized because of it. And it's very hard to treat at that point.
That's right.
Why is that?
Well, there's no drug for RSV specifically. Ribavirin has been used, very questionable whether it's effective. It's difficult to administer. It's got toxicities and all kinds of issues, and it's outrageously expensive. So it is tried in very, very severe children. We do have an antibody that we can give to kids who are particularly susceptible who are born with chronic heart or lung disease. And, our pediatric department here locally will know who those kids are and get them in for the monoclonal antibody shot before the season starts and then before December. We now have a vaccine that the mom can take, which will make antibodies in the mom that are transferred to the child and protect the child, along with all the other antibodies they get from their mother for the first year of life. So if a baby's going to be born around the time of year when RSV starts around usually late fall over the winter time, that would be the time to offer the mom that vaccine. We now have a vaccine, of course, that's approved in older people, and that vaccine has been shown to be quite effective. It's not 100%, well, 70% protection, and certainly, again, kind of like the COVID vaccine, you may get RSV, but you'll be much less likely to end up in hospital with it, which is a good thing, because RSV is nasty, can send people to hospital, and can make you very, very sick and lead to secondary infections, which are very problematic as well.
That reminds me of the 1918 influenza, where the vast majority of patients had got a secondary bacterial pneumonia and they didn't have antibiotics yet. So all these infections can just immunocompromise you even more and lead to more negative consequences.
That's right. Respiratory viruses kind of are like a lawnmower. They mow down all of this cilia on your respiratory epithelial cells. So they don't work so well anymore. And they're critical for your defense mechanism. And then the bacteria that we're all exposed to, like streptococcus, pneumoniae, or other bacteria, just have a field day, and you end up in big trouble. And of course, with the flu pandemic, the bacterial infections were what really killed people, and it was terrible.
Why is influenza such a unique pathogen? Does that have something to do with how much it mutates, that it's so hard to treat or create a vaccine that can cause sterilizing immunity for it?
Yeah, it does mutate, and every year we know that that we have to recreate the influenza vaccine formula based on last year, based on what happened in the southern hemisphere, in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, and all that. We collect all of that data from them, and they do the same when it's their turn to make their vaccine. They see what happened in North America, and so we're obligated to create a new variant of the vaccine that, about every decade or so, the virus has what's called as an antigenic shift. It does a whole reassortment of its genetic material. And as a result, you get a whole new strain, which, we hadn't seen before. And that leads to a pandemic such as we had in 2009 with H1N1. But what's really interesting is you remember all those variants of COVID that we saw. All of those were mutations. And so that's why we're seeing, multiple variants of COVID every year. And still, even this year, we're seeing new strains. The ones that are the most fit, the most able to transmit, they take over from the previous strains.
So what I hear you saying there, viruses naturally mutate. That's the point of them. And you can have mutations that will die out. They're redundant because they don't live, but the ones that thrive, it's kind of like a Rubik's Cube in a puzzle, just shifting each and every day. And we don't know what it's going to do. And we have to predict based on the southern hemispheres and what they experience to make the best vaccine tailored for the disease. But it's a very hard task to get it accurately and precise.
Yeah. The holy grail of research, and it is being worked on, is to create a vaccine that would be, pan-corona, that would go after all strains of all coronaviruses and would pick an antigen that wouldn't mutate. That's a tall order. Influenza vaccine to knock off not only the seasonal flu, but also the avian strains that we're very worried about. That would be a phenomenal accomplishment. And of course, then the ultimate vaccine is one you can take either orally or inhale and not through a needle, because that slows down the delivery of the product. And that would be, an inhaled pan-coronamian variant stable vaccine would be worth a Nobel Prize or two.
I was going to say that would help for the individuals that have needle phobia and are reluctant to get the vaccine because of just yet the needle. Let's play a quick mind experience. I want to be mindful of your time before we get into long COVID end there. If I gave organizations $500 billion and all the scientists focused on that problem, do you think it's feasible to create vaccines for RSV, influenza, or COVID that would help eliminate the transmission or reduce it to such a trivial point?
They're being worked on. There's two angles. One is working on an inhaled vaccine because they believe that mucosal immunity, it'd be like like using an inhaler. And there are some inhalers that have a powder, and you would inhale the vaccine in that way, and it would enter your respiratory tract and cause mucosal immunity, which is different from systemic immunity. There's different techniques and different nanoparticles that are being developed to deliver the product. Whether or not they can find an antigen that would be pan-flu or pan-corona, that's the other part of the puzzle. That's tricky because you got to find that antigen that won't mutate, and you won't get that resistance to it. And that's what we saw with the COVID variants and what we see with flu every year. So if groups of scientists, I guess, kind of come together and come up with an inhaled pan-corona, pan-influenza vaccine platform, like I said, there's a couple Nobel Prizes in it at least, and a lot of fame, maybe a lot of money to be made as well.
Like you said, a tall order to do that, but I am glad they're working on it.
I mean, if there's a silver lining to COVID, it's been the research that it's stimulated in this field. And Canada's a leading country in vaccine research. But, the rest of the world is working on it. And so I am hopeful that it will happen.
I'm hopeful too, and I'm very proud of the work done at Queen's and everywhere else in Canada, focusing on these problems. But to keep it broad, tell me about long COVID. What do you think about it?
Yeah, long COVID wasn't something that we saw coming initially, but as people recovered, from their first illness, they were not happy campers. They had shortness of breath, breathing difficulties, cardiac palpitations, syncope. They felt very fatigued if they did even the slightest simple chores, go to the grocery store. They'd spend the next 2 days in bed. Couldn't think straight. Their brain fog, and a whole bunch of things. Funny rashes, all kinds of things. And when those started to be seen over and over again, well, wait a minute, this is only being seen in the COVID patients, not in the people that didn't have COVID. So the phrase long COVID arrived. It's really not the best phrase. It implies, that the COVID is still in your body and still causing problems, which is true because the virus creates a state of viral persistence. It stays inside your body. And just where is sometimes a matter of debate, but it seems to be in certain types of white blood cells. And lots of other viruses persist in our bodies. We all know that the herpes virus, you get a cold sore comes back over and over again because the virus stays in your body and just comes out, just before, a special occasion or a family wedding or something, And we all know about varicella, chickenpox, causing shingles in about a third of older people because it remained dormant in your spinal cord all those years of your life and then comes out when you get older as a rash along your body. Very unpleasant and miserable. And HIV, we've known that it stays in the body and doesn't go away. We have drugs that make it really, really low now, which is amazing. But it doesn't get rid of it. It doesn't make it go away. So viral persistence is a reality, and there's good evidence of SARS-CoV-2 being viral persistent, and there's having persistence in the body, likely in certain kinds of white blood cells. And from there, it causes all kinds of mischief. It affects your immune function, causes what we know as immune dysregulation. And there's a whole bunch of symptoms of long COVID, a very long list, as I said, neurological manifestations. And so you kind of wonder, well, if you've had COVID 5 and 6 times, is that a good idea for your neurocognitive function? We know that it causes breathing problems. People have chronic lung problems and breathing difficulties, cardiac arrhythmias. It increases the risks of heart attack and strokes. So someone gets COVID, they recover, and then they have a blood clot out of the blue, and they were young and healthy. You go, that's really weird. Why is that? Well, COVID binds to the ACE receptor, the angiotensin converting enzyme receptor, that's on the lining of all of our blood vessel cells. So the endothelial cells all express this antigen, and it binds. So it's a vascular disease. It causes inflammation and problems in the back of the eye and the retina. People lose their sense of smell or their sense of taste. So it's doing something in our nervous system. There's been people have hearing loss, difficulties with new onset diabetes, kids that were type 1 potentially going to become type 1 diabetics but weren't, manifest more suddenly after COVID because it has an inflammatory effect on the pancreas. It just tips them over. More type 2 diabetics. The list is long. Renal, kidney problems. The list is really long. And there's not an organ system that long COVID can't impact on. And the scary bit is that in a very recent paper published for Canada, they looked at long COVID and its impact on work life, and I'll get to that. but their baseline was 18.7%, I think was the number of people in their sample that had long COVID. That tells me 18% of people walking on the street in Canada, or 40 million of us, might have some element of long COVID going on. That's what our chief science officer for Canada, Dr. Niemer, called a mass disabling event. That is very frightening.
And I'm just thinking if over 18% of individuals have that, and they're at increased risk of heart attacks, strokes, all these comorbidities, and if their IQ drops 3 points or they can't even work, what does that do to the economy and all these ripple effects? What does that do for home care and people having to care for them? Like all these negative effects just ripple.
It's very, very concerning. And this study was looking at the effects on work life, and they took working adults. So these were not studying people 65 and up or 70 or 80 who were retired. It was looking at people who were in their work life. And it found that the number of hours of that people lost in work, on when you average it all out, was a day a week. 8 hours a week of work was missed. Now, that's 20% of people missing 20% of their work. That's you spin that out in terms of the economic consequences and economic productivity. People working in industry building things, people working in construction, people working in schools, people working in the health profession, paramedics. And this isn't just the only study that's looked at this. The UK did a study of healthcare workers. They found a third, that's more than 18%, that's double that almost, had elements of long COVID to varying degrees. This is a big deal, and we're just letting it happen. So although the acute disease, the people suddenly die on is lower now, particularly in younger populations. Most 20-year-olds who 30-year-olds who get COVID, it's a cold or it was pretty mild. Some will get very sick and some will die, but if they pass it on to an older person, the risk of death is much higher. But if you're vaccinated, there's a protection against ending up in hospital or dying. But the long COVID is still an issue. Now, the vaccine likely prevents long COVID to some extent as well, maybe even by 40% or so. But that means there's still a lot of people getting long COVID. And so if I was, an economist or the, Minister of Finance for Canada, Mr. Champagne, I'd be worried about that.
It's a very sobering realization to think about that all. From a patient safety lens, imagine a third of healthcare workers were off because of long COVID or had a reduction in their IQ by 3 points, and that could affect patients coming in.
Well, yeah, you're a paramedic, you're in a critical situation, you're trying to make decisions of dosing and what are the next steps to deal with the situation that wasn't covered in any scenario, because you have to, your job is to create the best care situation. Sometimes you have to literally create it as you go, and that's normal in healthcare. And what about a pilot flying aircraft? The whole airline industry in tourism stopped doing protections. So that worries me a little bit. And the planes are very sophisticated. They quote, they say they fly themselves. Well, they don't. You need a pilot. What if there's an emergency on board? What about surgeons? What about school teachers? What about everybody? We're sleepwalking into this situation that is amenable to immediate remediation and control if we choose to do so. And I think we're crazy to not be putting the money into ventilation and filtration and UV lights and education and information in our schools, our universities, our colleges, our public institutions, our healthcare facilities on an urgent basis. And we haven't seen it. Some countries are doing it. Belgium, I know particularly, and there are other countries that have decided to do this. And that's great. It's time for you to put resources behind preventing the spread of COVID and other respiratory infections, and to do it now.
Because that goes back to your point. We do filtration, ventilation, all these preventative dramatically decrease the amount of infections, hospitalizations, You'll save healthcare spending, you'll save sick time for all these individuals, and now help the economy.
A healthy country is a wealthy country, but a wealthy country is not necessarily a healthy country. We've seen that all too often. These are simple interventions that have a huge impact, and it's an investment. It's just like cleaning the water that we drink. That costs money. Water purification is not free. We all pay for it. Well, air cleaning is something that we need to take and take seriously. We cannot take the air that we breathe for granted, and we have, and it's hurting us.
It's exactly what I was thinking. The return on investment, let's say a HEPA filter is $50. If we implement that in all the schools, how much would that help in the long term for economic value?
The cost calculation is in the trillions of dollars I've seen by economists in the U.S. Really? Well, okay. That's a lot of money. That's with a T. That's big money. And the more they update the calculation, the bigger the number gets.
I'll leave you this question, Love. Even though you're retired, you're still doing amazing work through all your organizations. Where's the line in the sand to say this was a success? Because this happened, I did this for the health of the population. What would that look like for you to sit back and think with your grandchildren, this was a success?
If was to acknowledge that this is a problem and we need to do something about it in terms of, infrastructure for ventilation, filtration, UV lights, research and education on these issues, and the deployment of these technologies throughout where they need to be deployed, which is pretty much everywhere, and educating the public and letting the public know what's really going on, putting up good data so that you don't have to search endlessly try to find out what's really going on. It's become almost impossible to do it now, and to just say, okay, we've got this issue, we're going to open our eyes, we're going to open our minds, we're going to just deal with it and fund research. If I hear and see that going on, I will kick back and retire full time and just enjoy. But right now, it's not comfortable where we are, so I have to continue to advocate.
I think it speaks volumes that you're still advocating in retirement, and you could be spending this time with family, because you can tell how passionate you are. And I think this conversation is really special because you didn't have any notes. You reamed all this off with just your memory and just your knowledge and just demonstrating your expertise. And you're always welcome back to come on and talk about more. And I wanted to mention this, that your two sons, paramedics, are amazing paramedics in Frontenac. Everyone I spoke to speaks highly of them, and of course raised an amazing family, have beautiful grandchildren, and it was a pleasure to learn from you in the process improvement course and learn from you today. So thank you so much, Dr. Zoutman.
Oh, my pleasure, Ryan. Thank you very much. Yeah, I brought up my sons. They're wonderful gentlemen. All three of them. One is an engineer, two are paramedics, and my grandchildren are a source of great joy.
This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not medical advice, does not establish a standard of care, and must not be used to diagnose, treat, or manage any medical condition or emergency. The content discussed reflects general principles that may not apply to every situation, system, or patient. Clinical practice varies by region, service, and jurisdiction. Always follow your local medical directives, clinical guidelines, protocols, and the instruction of your medical oversight or base hospital physician. The host, guests, and producers make no representation, guarantees, or warranties regarding the accuracy, applicability, or completeness of the information shared. The views expressed are those of the individuals and do not necessarily reflect those of their employer, regulatory bodies, or medical oversight authorities. By listening, you acknowledge that the host and guests assume no responsibility or liability for any actions taken or not taken based on the content of this podcast. This material is intended solely as a supplemental educational tools to support ongoing professional development, not a substitute for accredited training, certification, or authorized clinical guidelines.